Mrs. Vance had nodded, her expression unreadable. I see, she had said, and then, after a long pause, had changed the subject, allowing Sophie to retreat into her quiet world once more. The rain lashed against the windows of the small and cramped house, a fitting soundtrack to the storm brewing inside. Sophie stood in the center of the living room, a single duffel bag at her feet. It was a worn, faded bag, a physical representation of the life she had lived for 20 years, worn, faded, and filled with little but a profound emptiness. She was 25 years old, and in a matter of moments, the only home she had ever known was about to be taken from her. Now. As she wiped the mug, her thoughts were a whirlwind. What if the Reeds had lied? What if there was more to her story? The fire that took her birth parents seemed like a distant nightmare, a story she had been told to fill a void. But with the Reeds' betrayal still a fresh wound, she found herself questioning everything they had ever told her. The fear was quickly replaced by a fierce, burning curiosity. She wanted to know the truth. She deserved to know the truth. Mr. and Mrs. R. Reed, her adoptive parents, stood on opposite sides of the room, their faces contorted into masks of righteous anger. Clara, their biological daughter, a woman of the same age as Sophie, but with a lifetime of privilege etched onto her face, stood beside them, a smug, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. For years, Clara had been the sun in their solar system, and Sophie had been the discarded moon, a pale, forgotten satellite. Just then, the door to the cafe opened again, and a man walked in. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and his presence was so commanding it seemed to fill the small, cozy room. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, scanned the room before settling on her. He had a look of profound, aching sorrow in them, a look that mirrored her own secret pain. He walked directly to her, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. She had never seen this man before, yet there was something so familiar in his gaze, a phantom of a memory she couldn't place. "You've had your time, Sophie," Mrs. Reed said, her voice dripping with a venom that had become a familiar taste in Sophie's mouth. "We've done our duty. We've fed you, clothed you, put a roof over your head. But now, it's time for you to go." "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and rich, yet trembling with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Are you Sophie? Go." Sophie's voice was a whisper, a fragile thing against the roaring anger of the family. Go where Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. How did he know her name? A feeling of unease, a prickling of a long-dormant instinct, ran down her spine. "Yes," she said, her voice a little more than a whisper. "Who are you?" "That's not our problem," Mr. Reed said, his voice cold and final. "We've got Clara's wedding to pay for. We can't be saddled with a burden like you anymore. You've been useless your whole life. A drain on our resources. We're done." The man's eyes welled with tears. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, ornate locket. It was gold, intricately carved, and shaped like a crescent moon. It was the exact likeness of the birthmark on her wrist, a mark she had always kept hidden, a secret she thought only she knew. He held it out to her, his hand shaking uncontrollably. The words, though not new, were a fresh wound. For 20 years, Sophie had been a live-in maid, a silent servant in her own home. She cooked, she cleaned, she ran errands. She had never asked for anything, never complained. She had simply existed, hoping that one day, her quiet obedience would earn her a small measure of love or acceptance. But it was a futile hope. Their love was reserved for Clara, for the one who was truly theirs. "My name is Jonathan Sterling," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "And I think I'm your father." Clara, sensing her moment, stepped forward. "Oh, Sophie, don't be so dramatic," she said, her voice a cruel parody of kindness. "You're a grown woman. Go out there and find your own life. You can't expect us to take care of you forever." She then gestured to the duffel bag. "Did you pack everything? Don't forget your toothbrush. We wouldn't want you to be a burden on whoever takes you in next." The words hung in the air, a stunning, unbelievable revelation that shattered the quiet of the cafe. Sophie's world, which had just begun to rebuild itself, suddenly tilted on its axis, a whirlwind of disbelief, shock, and a fragile, terrifying hope. The past, which she had been told was a closed chapter, was now standing right in front of her, a man with a gold locket and a broken heart, a man who had spent 20 years searching for the lost daughter he never knew. Her journey, which had started with betrayal and loneliness, had finally led her to the one person who had been searching for her all along. The past she now knew was not a ghost. It was a living, breathing reality, and it was finally ready to be revealed. Time seemed to stand still in the cozy cafe. The small bell above the door was silent. The crackling fire in the hearth felt distant. Only two people remained: a trembling, wealthy man, a stunned young woman, and words that hung in the air between them. The words were a physical blow. Sophie's eyes, which had been dry, began to well with tears. The finality of the moment, the cold, brutal reality of her situation, hit her with a force that stole her breath. They had never loved her. She was not their daughter, she was their property, and they were now discarding her like a broken doll. "Father! My father!" Sophie's voice was a shaky, almost inaudible whisper. Doubt and fear swirled around her, but deep inside, a tiny spark of hope had begun to ignite. This man, with his tear-filled blue eyes so like her own, with a locket that perfectly matched her birthmark, was speaking the truth. She felt it with a strange, primal instinct she had never known. "I have something for you," Clara said, her smirk widening. She held out a small, crumpled envelope. "A little something to get you started." Mrs. Vance, who had been a silent witness to the scene, gently placed a hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Sophie, come to the back," she said softly, her voice full of understanding. "We need to talk." Sophie, her hands trembling, took the envelope. She opened it to find a single $100 bill. $100 for 20 years of her life, for a lifetime of servitude and heartbreak. They were giving her $100. It was an insult so profound it was almost comical. Jonathan, still trembling, nodded. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you. I've been looking for you for 20 years. He stared at Sophie, every wrinkle on his face a story of pain and loss. "This locket, it was a gift for my daughter, right after she was born. Her birthmark. It's exactly like this." Get out!" Mr. Reed said, his voice a low growl. "And don't ever come back. You're no longer a part of this family. You never were." Sophie was stunned. Everything she knew about her past was a lie. She wasn't an abandoned orphan. She was a stolen child. Another question, even bigger than the existence of her biological father, began to form in her mind. "My mother. Sophie looked at their faces one last time. She saw no regret, no sadness, no love. She saw only relief, a collective sigh of freedom from a burden they had carried for far too long. She looked at Clara, who was now hugging her parents, a triumphant look in her eyes. Sophie was a footnote in their lives, a character they had written out of their story. Jonathan's eyes darkened with a profound sadness. "Your mother. Elena. She died in a fire. The fire that destroyed our home. Everyone thought you both had perished. But I never believed it. I searched and searched, holding on to the fragile hope that you were still alive." With a heavy heart, Sophie turned and walked out the door. The rain, which had been a distant rumble, now fell in a cold, unforgiving torrent. It was a baptism of a new, lonely life. She walked down the street, the $100 bill clutched in her hand, the weight of her duffel bag a constant reminder of her newfound homelessness. She was an orphan again, a lost soul in a city of millions. The family she had so desperately tried to belong to had finally and completely betrayed her. But as she walked, a fierce resolve, a spark of rebellion she never knew she possessed, began to flicker inside her. She was alone, yes, but she was also free. Her story was not over. It was just beginning. His words fell like shards of broken glass, sharp and painful. The life she had known was a fabrication. The pain of the Reeds' betrayal suddenly felt much smaller than this horrific truth. She was not a discarded child. She was a missing child, stolen from the life she should have had. The city was a cold, indifferent monster, and Sophie was a tiny, insignificant speck swallowed by its vast, neon-lit gullet. The relentless rain soaked through her thin jacket, plastering her hair to her cheeks and mingling with the tears she no longer tried to hold back. Each step was a painful reminder of her lack of a home, a destination, a purpose. The $100 bill felt like a cruel joke. a flimsy shield against the harsh reality of her situation. She walked for what felt like hours. The duffel bag a lead weight on her shoulder, her mind a frantic, despairing kaleidoscope of her past. She saw Clara's smug face, the coldness in Mrs. Reed's eyes, the final, brutal words of Mr. Reed. She had been abandoned before, a baby left on a doorstep, but this felt worse. This felt like a deliberate act of erasure, a final declaration that she had never mattered. Mrs. Vance gently led Sophie into the kitchen. "Jonathan," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Give us a moment. Then we'll talk." Just as the last vestiges of her strength began to fade, a beacon of warmth appeared through the deluge. Tucked away on a quiet side street, nestled between a laundromat and a dusty old bookstore, was a small cafe. A soft, inviting glow emanated from its windows, promising warmth and shelter. The sign above the door, hand-painted and a little worn, read "The Cozy Nook Cafe." The smell of brewing coffee and fresh pastries, a scent so warm and comforting it felt like a hug, drifted out to meet her. Jonathan nodded, understanding that this was too much for the young woman to process. He sat down at an empty table, his trembling hand still clutching the locket. He had found his daughter. The search was over. But this was only the beginning of a new journey, a journey filled with questions, untold secrets, and wounds that needed to be healed. Hesitantly, Sophie pushed open the heavy wooden door. A little bell jingled cheerily, announcing her arrival. The air inside was thick with the scent of cinnamon and nostalgia. The cafe was a treasure trove of mismatched furniture, floral wallpaper, and shelves lined with books. In the corner, a fireplace crackled, its flames casting a dancing glow on the faces of the few customers. It was an oasis in the storm, a place where the world felt kind again. In the kitchen, Sophie collapsed into a wooden chair. Tears streamed down her face. Mrs. Vance poured her a glass of cold water and sat down beside her, remaining silent, giving her time to compose herself. Behind the counter stood an elderly woman with a halo of soft white hair and eyes that held the quiet wisdom of a long and well-lived life. She had a kind, crinkled smile that seemed to reach every corner of the room. She was Mrs. Eleanor Vance, the owner, and she watched Sophie with a gentle, discerning gaze. She saw the disheveled clothes, the tear-streaked face, and the desperate, lost look in her eyes. She didn't see a homeless woman. She saw a soul in pain. "The fire," Sophie said softly, her voice filled with bewilderment. "I always thought that my birth parents died. The Reeds told me that." Mrs. Vance didn't say a word. She simply poured a cup of tea, a fragrant blend of chamomile and mint, and placed it on the counter. "Sit down, child," she said, her voice as warm and comforting as the tea itself. "You look like you've had a long day. No charge." "The Reeds lied about so many things, my dear," Mrs. Vance said, her voice full of bitterness. "Since you arrived, I've seen a child living in fear and profound loneliness. I knew something wasn't right. Kindness is not something you pay for. It's a gift. It can't be traded." Sophie, her hands still trembling from the cold and shock, sank into a cushioned chair by the fire. The warmth from the flames began to seep into her bones, a feeling so foreign and welcome it made her want to weep. The tea was a soothing balm, a quiet comfort in a world of chaos. She sat there for a long time, the quiet hum of the cafe a soothing lullaby. Mrs. Vance, without another word, brought her a fresh croissant, warm and flaky, and a small bowl of chicken noodle soup. "Eat," she said simply. Sophie looked at Mrs. Vance, her face blurred with tears. "Why did they do it? Why did they steal me? I didn't even know I was stolen." As Sophie ate, the food warming her from the inside out, Mrs. Vance sat opposite her, a cup of her own tea in her hands. "A storm will pass, child," she said, her voice low and gentle. "And sometimes, a storm is exactly what we need to wash away the old and make way for the new. We may never know the real reason," Mrs. Vance said, her voice becoming more resolute. "But you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know who your father is, and who your mother was. Your story didn't begin with abandonment. It began with love, a love that survived for 20 years, despite all the lies, all the loss. Tears, fresh and honest, began to fall. Sophie, for the first time in her life, felt safe enough to let her guard down. She didn't recount the whole sordid tale of her life, but she spoke of being alone, of being cast out, of the fear and the shame. Mrs. Vance listened, her eyes filled with a deep, bottomless well of empathy. Mrs. Vance's words were a calming balm, a gentle truth that soothed the pain of betrayal. Sophie had lived in a ghost story, a narrative written by those who had exploited her. But now, she had found the truth. She had found a father who had been searching for her, a father she never knew was waiting. When Sophie was done, Mrs. Vance just smiled. "I have a small room upstairs, above the cafe," she said. "It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and it's dry. I'm getting old, and my knees aren't what they used to be. I could use an extra pair of hands around here. A few hours a day, serving customers, helping in the kitchen. In exchange, you get a roof over your head, 3 meals a day, and a small salary. What do you say?" After a while, Sophie wiped her tears and stood up. She walked back into the main room, where Jonathan sat, his face etched with worry. She approached him, no longer trembling. Sophie's heart, which had been a frozen block for so long, felt a sudden, thrumming beat of life. The offer was so simple, so kind, so utterly unexpected. For a moment, she was suspicious. What was the catch she had been taught her whole life, that nothing was ever free, that every act of kindness came with a price? "Father," she said, her voice clear and strong this time, "can you tell me everything about my mother? And about the fire?" But as she looked into Mrs. Vance's eyes, she saw no hidden agenda, no ulterior motive. She saw only genuine, unadulterated kindness. It was a lifeline in an ocean of despair. With a shaky voice, Sophie said, "Yes, yes, please. Thank you." Tears streamed down Jonathan's face again. He nodded, his voice choked with emotion. "Of course, my dear. We have a lot to talk about." Mrs. Vance just smiled, a gentle, knowing smile. "Welcome home, child," she said, and as the rain outside finally subsided, a beautiful, hopeful calm settled over Sophie's heart. Her story had not ended on the streets. It had found a new, quiet beginning in the warmth of a small cafe, with a kind stranger who saw her, not for what she had been, but for what she could become. He began to tell her the story of Elena, the woman he had loved so deeply, of the first days of their love, of her smile, of the joy of knowing they would have a child. He spoke of his first days as a father, of how tightly he held her, of her first smile, and of the locket he had designed himself as a gift for her. His story was a tapestry woven from love and pain, a past Sophie had never known. He recounted the night of the fire, the sirens, the smoke, and the chaos of having to flee the burning house. Across town, in the hushed, sterile opulence of a penthouse suite, a man sat staring at a photograph, Jonathan Sterling, a name synonymous with power, wealth, and ruthless efficiency, was, in this moment, just a man consumed by a single, unshakable grief. The photograph was of a woman with a gentle yet kind smile, his late wife, Elena. Next to it was a more recent image, grainy and blurry. Taken from a street camera's feed, it showed a young woman from a distance, her head slightly bowed, her hair a cascade of dark curls. The resolution was poor, but the resemblance, the almost ghost-like echo of his Elena, was enough to make his heart ache with a fragile, dangerous hope. "I searched for you," he said, his voice trembling, his eyes bloodshot. "But they told me you were gone. They couldn't find you. They told me you were dead." For 20 years, Jonathan had been a ghost himself. He had built an empire, yes, but it was a cold, empty thing. The fire that had stolen his wife had also taken his infant daughter, a tragedy that had shattered his world into a million irreparable pieces. Every day since had been a search, a relentless, desperate quest for a child he was told was lost forever. He had spent billions on private investigators, on forensic experts, on a network of informants. He had traveled the world, chasing down every dead end, every false lead, every cruel trick of the light. Jonathan paused, unable to continue. Marcus, who had been standing silently in the corner, stepped forward and put a hand on Jonathan's shoulder. "We searched everywhere, sir. We hired hundreds of detectives. We combed through every orphanage, every hospital. I looked at thousands of faces, hoping for a sign, but all we found was disappointment. Until we found you here." "Sir," a voice cut through the silence. "Marcus, his loyal and long-suffering assistant, stood in the doorway. The lead on the photograph, it was taken in the vicinity of a small cafe on Elm Street. We have a list of all businesses and residential buildings in the area. Sophie listened to his story, and she understood. The pain she felt was not hers alone. It was a pain shared by a father she'd never known. She wasn't a discarded child. She was a missing child. Her tears now were no longer tears of despair, but tears of understanding. Jonathan didn't look up from the photo. And the woman? So, why was I with the Reeds? Sophie asked, her voice filled with questions. Did they steal me? Why? We still don't have a name, sir, but she has been seen in the area frequently. The most recent sighting was 3 days ago, matching the description on the lead. We don't know, my dear, Jonathan said, but I will find out. I will find the truth. Everything will be revealed. Marcus had been with Jonathan for 25 years, and he had seen the man go from a driven, ambitious CEO to a heartbroken shell of a man, haunted by a past he couldn't change. He had shared Jonathan's grief, had been a silent witness to his private torment. This new lead, this flicker of hope, was both a blessing and a curse. Marcus was afraid for Jonathan. He had seen the man get his hopes up too many times, only to have them crushed, leaving him more broken than before. Jonathan, the man Sophie had thought was a wealthy stranger, was now not just her father, but her hero. He was the man who had searched for her his entire life. He was the man who had never given up. While she had lived in a world of lies and cruelty, he had built another world, a world of truth, and he was now inviting her into it. Her life didn't begin with betrayal, it began with loss. And finally, that loss had been found. Her story had found a new starting point, not in desperation, but in a profound love. A love that had been reborn after 20 years. Jonathan's face, a mask of profound grief moments before, now hardened with a new, quiet resolve. He was a man accustomed to fighting battles, to dismantling empires, to pursuing his goals with ruthless efficiency. Now, the goal was not profit or power, but justice and the reclamation of his daughter's life. He looked at Sophie, his eyes brimming with a protective ferocity she had never witnessed. "Book a car for tomorrow morning," Jonathan said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "We'll canvass the area. I want to see this place for myself." He finally looked up at Marcus, his eyes, usually so sharp and calculating, now filled with a desperate, pleading vulnerability. "Marcus, you saw the picture, the resemblance. It's uncanny. This is not the end of our search. Sophie," he said, his voice low and firm. "It is the beginning of a new one. We will find out who the Reeds are, why they took you, and what happened that night. Every lie they've told, every moment they've stolen, they will answer for." "I did, sir," Marcus said, his voice gentle. "It's a strong lead, the strongest we've had in years." Sophie, still reeling from the revelations, felt a new emotion stir within her, a powerful, cleansing anger. It was not the despair of a lost girl, but the righteous fury of a woman who had been wronged. She looked from her father's determined face to Mrs. Vance's compassionate one. For the first time, she wasn't alone. She would be 25 now, Jonathan mused, his gaze drifting back to the photograph of his wife. Just like her mother. Just like Elena. He ran a hand over his face, a gesture of profound weariness. 20 years. 20 years of nothing. And now, this... "I want to help," she said, her voice stronger than she thought possible. "I want to know the truth. They took so much from me. I want to know why." Marcus knew better than to offer false platitudes. He simply nodded, his presence a silent comfort. The truth was, this wasn't just a search anymore. It was a pilgrimage, a man's final, desperate attempt to reclaim a piece of his lost soul. The city, which was a cold, indifferent monster to Sophie, was, to Jonathan, a labyrinth of hope, a place where a 20-year-old wound might finally begin to heal. The search was intensifying, and in the heart of this vast, sprawling city, two lives, once destined to be together, were slowly, inexorably, beginning to converge. Jonathan's smile was a fleeting, sad thing, but it was there. "You will," he said, reaching across the table to take her hand. His touch was warm, a solid anchor in her turbulent world. But first, you need to rest. You need time to process all of this. This is your home now. With me. No more running, no more pretending. The next morning, the city was a different beast entirely. The rain had washed away the grime, and the sun shone with a gentle warmth, promising a new day. Jonathan Sterling, dressed in a bespoke suit that cost more than most people's annual salaries, sat in the back of a black sedan, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Marcus, a silent but ever-vigilant presence, drove with practiced efficiency. Their destination, the Cozy Nook Cafe. Mrs. Vance nodded in agreement. He's right, child. The path forward is not built in a day. You have a lifetime of catching up to do, with each other. Jonathan's heart, a muscle he had long thought to be cold and inert, now beat with a frantic, insistent rhythm. The hope, so carefully guarded for 2 decades, had escaped its cage and was now a wild, untamable thing inside him. He tried to temper it, to prepare for another disappointment, another false alarm, but the photograph of the young woman in the street, with her cascade of dark curls and the ghost of a smile, was a memory he could not shake. For the rest of the day, the Cozy Nook Cafe became a sanctuary for 3 people linked by a miracle. Jonathan, with the help of Marcus, began making calls, his voice a low, commanding rumble as he mobilized his vast resources. He spoke of lawyers, investigators, and a thorough search of every record related to the fire and the orphanage. He was a force of nature, a man who had waited 20 years to unleash his power on those who had harmed his child. The car pulled up to the curb, and Jonathan's eyes immediately fixed on the hand-painted sign above the door. The Cozy Nook Cafe. It seemed so small, so unassuming, a world away from the sterile, silver towers he inhabited. Marcus opened the car door for him, but Jonathan didn't move. He sat there, taking in the scene, his gaze fixed on the front window. A young woman was behind the counter, laughing with a customer, her face lit up by the morning sun. Her hair was pulled back, but a few loose curls had escaped, framing a face that was a mirror image of the one in his photograph. Sophie sat by the fire, listening, her hand in Jonathan's. The locket was no longer just a beautiful piece of jewelry. It was a symbol of a past she was reclaiming. It was a tangible link to a mother she had never known and a father who had never forgotten her. The world had turned upside down, but for the first time in her life, Sophie felt like she was standing on solid ground. Jonathan's breath hitched in his throat. It was her, the woman from the picture. But as she turned her head to grab a coffee cup, the sunlight hit her face in a different way, and he saw it. The same high cheekbones, the same shape of her eyes, the same delicate curve of her mouth. He wasn't looking at a resemblance. He was looking at a living, breathing echo of his wife, his late wife, Elena. A woman who had been dead for 20 years was standing right there in front of him, serving coffee. The betrayal of the Reeds, once the defining trauma of her life, now felt like a closed chapter. It was a dark and painful part of her past, but it was not her entire story. Her story was one of survival, of a relentless search, and of a reunion against all odds. Her journey, which had started with betrayal and loneliness, had finally led her to the one person who had been searching for her all along. The past, she now knew, was not a ghost. It was a living, breathing reality, and she was finally ready to face it. With her father by her side, she was Sophie Sterling, and her new life was just beginning. The next morning, Sophie woke up to a new world. The worn duffel bag was gone, replaced by a spacious but sun-drenched room in a penthouse that looked over the entire city. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. She was no longer a discarded daughter. She was a found child. Jonathan had arranged for a DNA test, and the results, delivered to him just hours ago, had confirmed the truth beyond any doubt. The locket, the birthmark, the resemblance, it had all been true. Marcus, a man of quiet observation, saw it too. He saw the way Jonathan's hand trembled, the way his eyes, usually so hard and unreadable, had filled with a profound, aching sorrow. He saw the silent, desperate plea in his boss's face. Without a word, Marcus went to the counter and ordered a coffee, his eyes never leaving the young woman. He was discreet, professional, and a keen observer. He watched as she took his order, her movements graceful and fluid. He saw the kindness in her eyes as she thanked him. And then, as she handed him the coffee, he saw it. Now, She stood beside Jonathan in a lawyer's office, a sleek, modern space with a view that could humble a king. Marcus stood a few paces behind them, his face a grim mask of support. Jonathan's legal team, a formidable group of men and women in tailored suits, had laid out a clear, devastating strategy. They had evidence of the Reeds' deception, of the false records they had submitted to the orphanage, and of their calculated cruelty towards her. It was a small, pale birthmark on the inside of her left wrist. It was shaped like a tiny, delicate crescent moon, a mark so specific and so unique that Jonathan had once had a gold locket made in its exact likeness for his infant daughter. He had kept it, a small, tangible piece of a past he couldn't let go of. The locket was in his pocket right now. "We have enough evidence to prosecute them for fraud and kidnapping," Jonathan said, his voice flat, emotionless. "They took my daughter. For 20 years. They took a piece of me, a piece of Elena, and they will pay for it." Marcus's blood ran cold. The coincidence was too great. The resemblance was too strong. The birthmark was the final, undeniable proof. He discreetly held up his phone, his camera app open, and snapped a quick photo of her wrist. He then walked back to the car, his heart pounding. He opened the door and sat down, his face a mask of shock and awe. Sophie listened, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and triumph. It was a strange feeling, this righteous anger. It was a fire that burned away the years of fear and quiet servitude. This was not a fight she had to face alone. She had a father, a powerful, determined man who was now fighting for her. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He showed Jonathan the photograph. The image was grainy, but the small, crescent-shaped mark was unmistakable. "It's her! It's really her!" The confrontation with the Reeds was scheduled for that afternoon at their home. Jonathan insisted on going with Sophie. He wanted her to feel safe, to know that she was not alone. As they drove to the small, cramped house, a feeling of dread washed over Sophie. It was the place where she had been a ghost, a servant, a burden. Going back felt like a betrayal of her new life. Jonathan looked at the photo, then at the young woman inside the cafe, then back at the photo of his late wife. His eyes, which had held so much sorrow for so long, now overflowed with a torrent of tears he had held back for 2 decades. The billionaire, the ruthless titan of industry, broke down, a man completely undone by the sudden, overwhelming reality of a miracle. He had found her. After 20 years of relentless searching, he had found his daughter. The journey had been long and painful, but it had finally led him home. When they arrived, the Reeds and Clara were waiting. The air was thick with tension, a palpable cloud of fear and confusion. They were no longer the powerful, cruel figures from a day ago. They were small, scared people whose world was about to crumble. Mr. Reed, his face pale, tried to speak. "What is this? What's going on?" The cafe's little bell chimed, but for the first time, Sophie didn't look up with her usual friendly smile. She was lost in thought, polishing a glass mug until it gleamed, her mind replaying the morning's quiet, heartfelt conversation with Mrs. Vance. It had been a month since she arrived, and the cafe had become more than a place of shelter. It was a sanctuary. The kindness of Mrs. Vance had been a revelation, a stark contrast to the cold indifference of her former life. This morning, as they sipped coffee together, Mrs. Vance had asked her a simple question. Jonathan didn't answer. He simply looked at Sophie, a silent question in his eyes. Sophie took a deep breath, her hands no longer trembling. "You told me my parents died in a fire," she said, her voice clear and steady. "You told me you adopted me from an orphanage. You lied." "Sophie," she had said, her voice as gentle as always. "Do you know who your birth parents are?" Clara, always the first to lash out, scoffed. "Oh, here we go. What is this, some kind of fairy tale?" she said, looking from Sophie to Jonathan. "Who is this man? Another one of your strays." The question, so innocent on the surface, had brought a wave of pain and fear. It was a wound she had kept carefully hidden, a box she had never dared to open. "I was told they died in a fire," Sophie had replied, her voice shaky. "I was adopted from an orphanage after the accident. That's all I know." "This man," Jonathan said, his voice a low growl that filled the room, "is my father, Jonathan Sterling." Mrs. Vance had nodded, her expression unreadable. "I see," she had said, and then, after a long pause, had changed the subject, allowing Sophie to retreat into her quiet world once more. The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Mr. and Mrs. Reed's faces went from pale to ashen. Jonathan Sterling. The name was synonymous with power. He was a man they had seen on news reports, a face that graced the covers of business magazines. The full weight of their deception, the magnitude of the man they had wronged, finally hit them. Now, as she wiped the mug, her thoughts were a whirlwind. What if the Reeds had lied? What if there was more to her story? The fire that took her birth parents seemed like a distant nightmare, a story she had been told to fill a void. But with the Reeds' betrayal still a fresh wound, she found herself questioning everything they had ever told her. The fear was quickly replaced by a fierce, burning curiosity. She wanted to know the truth. She deserved to know the truth. We didn't know, Mrs. Ayn Reed stammered, her cruel facade crumbling. We found her. In a fire. She was just a baby. We thought she was an orphan. Just then, the door to the cafe opened again, and a man walked in. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and his presence was so commanding it seemed to fill the small, cozy room. His eyes, a startling shade of blue, scanned the room before settling on her. He had a look of profound, aching sorrow in them, a look that mirrored her own secret pain. He walked directly to her, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. She had never seen this man before. Yet there was something so familiar in his gaze, a phantom of a memory she couldn't place. Jonathan smiled, but it was a cold, humorless expression. "The fire that you set," he said. "The fire that almost killed my wife, and almost killed my daughter. My legal team has the records. Mrs. Reed, we have the proof." "Excuse me," he said, his voice deep and rich, yet trembling with an emotion he couldn't hide. "Are you Sophie?" He gestured to a folder Marcus was holding. "We have everything. Every lie, every forgery, every stolen moment. You wanted to get rid of Sophie. You wanted her out of your house. You got your wish. She will never have to see your faces again." Sophie's heart hammered in her chest. How did he know her name? A feeling of unease, a prickling of a long-dormant instinct, ran down her spine. "Yes," she said, her voice a little more than a whisper. "Who are you?" Clara, her smug smirk replaced with a look of pure terror, tried to interject, but... "The wedding." "Our wedding." The man's eyes welled with tears. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, ornate locket. It was gold, intricately carved, and shaped like a crescent moon. It was the exact likeness of the birthmark on her wrist, a mark she had always kept hidden, a secret she thought only she knew. He held it out to her, his hand shaking uncontrollably. Jonathan didn't even look at her. "The money you've been spending, the money for your lavish lifestyle, it was a pittance compared to what you've stolen. And it's all about to be taken away. You don't deserve a wedding. You don't deserve anything. You deserve to face the consequences of your actions." "My name is Jonathan Sterling," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "And I think I'm your father." The Reeds and Clara were utterly defeated. The power they had wielded over Sophie for 20 years was now a weapon turned against them. They were no longer in control. They were a defeated army, a footnote in a story they had tried to write. The words hung in the air, a stunning, unbelievable revelation that shattered the quiet of the cafe. Sophie's world, which had just begun to rebuild itself, suddenly tilted on its axis, a whirlwind of disbelief, shock, and a fragile, terrifying hope. The past, which she had been told was a closed chapter, was now standing right in front of her, a man with a gold locket and a broken heart, a man who had spent 20 years searching for the lost daughter he never knew. Her journey, which had started with betrayal and loneliness, had finally led her to the one person who had been searching for her all along. The past, she now knew, was not a ghost. It was a living, breathing reality, and it was finally ready to be revealed. The cafe's little bell chimed, but for the first time, Sophie didn't look up with her usual friendly smile. She was lost in thought, polishing a glass mug until it gleamed, her mind replaying the morning's quiet, heartfelt conversation with Mrs. Vance. It had been a month since she arrived, and the cafe had become more than a place of shelter. It was a sanctuary. The kindness of Mrs. Vance had been a revelation, a stark contrast to the cold indifference of her former life. This morning, as they sipped coffee together, Mrs. Vance had asked her a simple question. Sophie looked at their faces one last time. She saw no remorse, no apology, only a raw, naked fear. The pain was still there, but it was no longer her pain alone. It was a shared pain, and with the justice that was now about to be served, she felt a profound sense of closure. Her new life, with her father, was not just a new beginning. It was a redemption. She was Sophie Sterling, a woman who was finally reclaiming her past, her present, and her future. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Stay with us for the next one. And while you're here, check out our other videos. There's always more to explore. Sophie, she had said, her voice as gentle as always. Do you know who your birth parents are? Where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments below. The question, so innocent on the surface, had brought a wave of pain and fear. It was a wound she had kept carefully hidden, a box she had never dared to open. I was told they died in a fire, Sophie had replied, her voice shaky. I was adopted from an orphanage after the accident. That's all I know.